Some of these monumental pyramids were later used by the new civilization, the one we are all in, for various religious purposes. We particularly note the pyramids used by an Inca culture that sacrificed humans and animals in the vain attempt to overpower the population into submission, and also in the vain hopes of appeasing the gods whom the priests feared. Once again, we are faced with the fact that so-called experts claim that these giant pyramids were created by Incas. And we are talking not only about the complicated pyramids, but also the monumental wall-like structures created of stones that the Incas openly admitted that they did not build, but that was already there when the Incas arrived in the area. We cannot really move on without mentioning huge blocks of stone cut from bedrock and abandoned before being quite finished. These massive blocks of stone were left on site when the latest ELE struck and caused all work to cease. Once again, experts try to tell us that they were carved from the bedrock by workers using copper chisels and stone balls. Quite apart from the fact that it would have been utterly impossible to cut and shape these massive stone blocks with primitive tools, they do not even attempt to explain how these workers intended to raise the finished blocks, some weighing over 1,000 tons, with simple rope and pulley tools that they had. I could go on. One of the last things I will mention are the magnificently carved and polished statues and the so-called boxes and vases, all carved and polished to perfection and found in Egypt, all made with simple tools and using sand to polish them, according to modern experts. I will also mention the tubes cut into hard rock, once again made with simple tools, according to experts. It is sad, really, to think that intelligent and well-schooled men and women are so blind to the fact that virtually none of these objects could have been made by races of people who were barely out of the Stone Age themselves. Indeed, the vast majority of these objects could not be made today, at the time that I am writing this book. In a site called the Serapeum in Egypt, there are a number of huge stone boxes, mostly with a perfect finish and some with lids and some without. The question is, what were they used for? We have to admit that we do not know for certain. We know how these boxes were made, but we do not know why. Obviously, as such a lot of work went into making them, they must have been important. I will describe the technique used to make them a bit later in this chapter, but I wish first to describe the rest of the techniques and tools used by this civilization, and then we will discuss what the elements created were used for. After the comparatively simple, to that civilization, task of softening and/or melting granite and other hard stones, we must describe how they were moved. Once again, modern archaeologists either ignore how they were removed and raised into elevated positions, or if they do mention the subject, they suggest that the stones were moved using lots of manpower and round logs like tree trunks. They have no credible answer to describe how the blocks of stone were raised, sometimes to impressive heights, nor how they were fitted precisely into position. The truth of the matter is that, as everything is made by frequencies, or vibrations if you prefer, stone is created by atoms coming together and being held together by gravity, which is another form of frequency. We've discussed this topic elsewhere, so I won't repeat the subject. It suffices to accept that everything in so-called physicality is matter coming together by vibrations. This being the case, this previous civilization discovered that by using suitable frequencies blasted at the stone, its weight could be negated and the stones moved by gentle pushing with the hands. So these enormous and potentially unmovable blocks of stone, once quarried, were blasted by frequency generators, and when the correct frequency was obtained, the blocks would be weightless, at which point they could be lifted from the quarry site, transported to where they were needed, and placed in position. Then, the frequency generators would be switched off and the stone resumed its original weight. So, lifting and transporting extremely heavy stones was simple for this race of people. This technique was known about and used all over the world where stone monuments were required. Now, let us go on for a moment and discuss how stone was quarried, sawn, or drilled. Archaeologists and various scientists have puzzled over this and have, quite rightly, dismissed the idea that it was all done using copper chisels and stone balls. They have also come to the conclusion that the work was achieved using diamond-tipped tools and very advanced machines. This also is not correct. Certainly this civilization had very advanced lathes and other tools, but in fact the trick with cutting or forming the work in stone was to soften the stone using microwaves, at which point the stone could be cut using simple saws, tube drills and other tools much as we use today. There was no need to use diamond-tipped saws or tube drills. As the stones were soft as putty, they could be cut with simple hand tools. Next, let us look at the huge stones found half-quarried, found in Baalbek, Lebanon. These clearly show scoop marks and were carved from the bedrock, first by softening the stone and then scooping the excess stone away using scoop-shaped shovels, rather resembling huge spoons. Imagine taking a block of ice cream, allowing it to soften somewhat, and then scooping the outside of the ice cream away using spoons. If you can visualize this and then enlarge the vision to a 1,000-ton block of granite, the same technique was used. Now we go on to look at the statues in museums attributed to Ramses. These beautiful statues, and others, often repeated, meaning that there is more than one of them, sometimes large numbers, all identical. These were achieved by making molds from stone, just as we would today when creating many identical objects. Then, liquid rock was poured into them, allowed to set, and the molds pulled apart. Any rough edges would be smoothed, while the rock was still malleable, until it was perfectly smooth. At this point, the rock would be left to harden. Let us now turn to how the shiny finish was applied. Scientists assume that rock was polished by sand until it shone, but this is not the case. In fact, this civilization managed to make, we don't know how, a form of plastic sheeting, and the objects that needed to have a shiny finish were wrapped in this material that eventually hardened and stuck to the rock, forming a rock-hard surface to the stone. The only parallels we can suggest to clarify the technique used is to think of French polish applied to wood. This hardens and forms a shiny surface. Or perhaps imagine how people today might wrap a car or any other object with shiny plastic. But we must say that the plastic that was used did not come from oil. We do not know how the wrapping material was made, but we do know that it could be made into sheets and applied to the surface of stones, as some people today wrap cars and other items. Or it could be made liquid and applied as people today apply French polish to wooden furniture. Once it hardened, it became as hard as the rock itself. What happened to the tools, and why are none found today? You must realize that when the ELE occurred, the devastation was immense and the tools were flung far and wide away from the sites where they were being used. Some were flung into oceans, others ended up in jungles. You must remember that the vast majority of these tools were simple handheld tools. Quite what they were made from, we do not know, because the Akashic record does not record the making of the materials that were used. We must assume that they were made of a form of steel. We must also add to the mystery the fact that, although the ELE occurred about 13,000 years ago, the creative process had been going on for hundreds of thousands of years. So many simple tools had been created, worn out, and recycled by this civilization. As, at the time of the catastrophe, there was not a great deal of work going on, and as the tools were flung far from the sites where they were being used, as were the people of that civilization as the planet rotated. And we add to the mix that even 13,000 years is a long time, and time has helped recycle the metals used, it is not surprising that no tools are found. Always bear in mind that large, complicated machines such as we use today were not necessary. The fact that stone could be softened or liquefied enabled simple tools to be used, certainly no more complex than any carpenter, motor mechanic or house builder would have in his toolbox. So, at the risk of disappointing some people who might have hoped that we would describe huge and very advanced tools, we have to say that our investigations have revealed that stone could be softened or liquefied, and once that was achieved, it could be worked much as clay is used today. Add to that the fact that even the heaviest of rocks could be made weightless using vibrations. Think of, in the Bible, the walls of Jericho tumbling down under the vibrations caused by trumpets. and you can start to realize that this previous civilization, although very advanced, did not need exotic tools to cut or mold rock. Just before we end this chapter, let us think about what happened to their flying machines. Once again, due to the fact that the Akashic record does not contain the memories of anything non-human, it is difficult for us to be certain of the fate of these machines. Certainly a lot of them have been destroyed and time has recycled the materials used, but we think that some at least were able to fly to places like the moon, where certainly they would have to battle with the reptilians that guard the moon. But as far as we are concerned, they are lost to us. So we apologize, but we can offer no information on the fate of these flying objects. Therefore, I will bring this chapter to a close. I have only given a brief overview of this civilization. A more complete description is outside of the scope of this book. I have told you what we know of this civilization and of the tools they used to cut stone. I've also been honest and told you what we don't know. I hope that I've said enough to help you understand where many of the stone monuments found on Earth come from and how they were made.